to another lecture video for English 120 Critical Writing. Today I wanted to discuss and talk about our reading from, I know this is backwards, this is the book Borderlands Lecture by Gloria Anzaldua. If you haven't read this already, I don't know if there's an appropriate order, whether to watch this first or read it first, but whichever you've no doubt chose is probably for the best. So, excuse me. So, Borderlands La Frontera, the reason why I have you read the preface for this first, and hopefully if you enjoy this, perhaps I can assign more from this collection. But it's a collection of essays, and we read the first one, Homeland. And what I want us to focus on when it comes to how we want to read Homeland and this book in general is to focus on, our work in terms of definition essays. What is Anzaldua trying to define here? One thing that we can consider or argue that she's defining is borders, right? So in the preface, she refers to herself as a excuse me. I gotta skip. All right. So in the preface, she says, "I am a border woman. I grew up between two cultures: the Mexican, with a heavy Indian influence. Indian meaning referring to indigenous people, so indigenous Mexican, and the Anglo, as a member of a colonized people in our own territory. I have been straddling that Tejas Mexican border and others all my life. It's not a comfortable territory to live in. This place of contradictions, hatred, anger, and exploitation are the prominent features of this landscape." Now, she talks about a physical landscape. However, as we kind of read, I'm so sorry. As we kind of read, we begin to understand that the borders that she refers to are not just the borders being these sort of invisible lines in the sand. The line that says Mexico stops here and the United States starts here. Or even, she lives in Texas, where Texas stops and, say, Oklahoma begins, or any of the other states that are adjacent to Texas. No, she goes beyond just the simple, I don't even know if I'd call them concrete borders, as they are just kind of invisible lines in the sand, but she goes beyond talking about just the definition of borders in terms of territory. And she is discussing borders with regard to language, because some of what she refers to in the language that she speaks is like she said, it's, she's Chicana, but also there is an influence of indigenous Mexican culture as well, and she also speaks, American English. And so this idea of the borders of language also come into play, right? As sure, for any of you who may have traveled to a place where the dominant language is not one that you speak, perhaps you've felt that. Is what is it to have a border within your own linguistic capability, right? Because it's not just a line in the sand that we cross when we cross into another country. There are also borders of language. To not be able to speak the language of a country that you're in is a significant border, because how do you communicate, right? Do we gesture hugely loudly, right? Do we speak slower and louder and just hope that works? um, I've seen American tourists in other countries. Some that is a definitely a strategy. However, is it, is that a border that we can cross as easily as one from one territory to another, right? I've had the privilege of the experience of driving across Europe, and in many places, crossing into another country, even many of the countries don't share languages in Europe, and yet driving from one to the other was as simple as driving from, say, New York to New Jersey, or New York to Connecticut, right? You just go across. There's this invisible line that we've traversed, and suddenly we're somewhere else. And there are more borders besides that Anzaldua is referring to. She herself is a queer person, right? And so we have then the borders of sexuality. Are we only talking the borders of who we're attracted to, or the borders of what we then experience in our own lives, right? Of having a difference. Because that's so much of what she's sort of referring to when she talks about borders in her life. And so whether or not you have read Homeland or are going to read it after this video, those are the only two possibilities. I'm sure there are those who might skip the reading altogether, but they don't exist, those people, right? No, instead, Anzaldua is talking about borders not just as lines of territory. She herself is defining what a border is, right? And so I want to challenge you, and as you're reading this, what would you consider like the definition of a border? Right? I mean, and that's the thing. It's like, I know we have set definitions, right? We talked about this last week. There are dictionaries, and dictionaries, they have definitions. But that's decided by us in a way, right? We decide how we want to use a word, and in what context, and what that word then will mean. That's the power of the people, right? And it's in that I want us to start considering sort of our own definitions to these things. I mean, so much of what she's doing in this work is creating a space where we can kind of challenge and question what a border is, right? It's not just this land dispute, because in Homeland she talks about how overnight, the territory that was once Mexico suddenly was the United States. So on page 29, at least in my copy, it says, in 1846, the U.S. incited Mexico to war. U.S. troops invaded and occupied Mexico, forcing her to give up almost half of her nation, what is now Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and California. With the victory of the U.S. forces over the Mexican in the U.S.-Mexican War, los norteamericanos pushed the Texas border down 100 miles from El Rio Nueces to El Rio Grande. South Texas ceased to be part of the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. I apologize for my pronunciation. Separated from Mexico, the native Mexican Texan no longer looked toward Mexico as home. The Southwest became our homeland once more. The border fence that divides the Mexican people was born on February 2nd, 1848. With the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it left 100,000 Mexican citizens on this side, annexed by conquest along with the land. The land established by the treaty as belonging to Mexicans was soon swindled away from its owners. The treaty was never honored, and restitution to this day has never been made. And with that, she's kind of referring to this idea that with a sign of a pen, with a little flourish of ink, you had so many people who were in their home country suddenly in a country that's not theirs. What a strange phenomenon. The ground did not change. It's not as though the ground beneath their feet suddenly was something else or something different. It was only decided, right? I mean, on February 9th, it was signed into law or whatever that the Gulf of Mexico is now the Gulf of America. That was this month. That was what, like 12 days ago, something like that. February 9th. Just like that. The water is the same. And it would be almost as if New York, because I'm assuming many of us are living there currently, if New York was just suddenly the property of the Netherlands because of some sort of treaty, and we, as U.S. citizens, or some varying degree of resident, we are suddenly in a foreign country, but we've not moved. It's peculiar, yes? And that's something that I want us to consider. This is a great use of example, right? So she uses history as a way to get us to challenge our thinking on what a border is. She uses history, she uses anecdote. And now, if for those of us who don't know what an anecdote is, an anecdote is a personal story. So you've probably experienced anecdote, but being aware of it's something altogether different. So an anecdote is a personal story, and typically it is used in such a way as to be persuasive. Say if we were to argue gun control, and we might, someone might say, well, my aunt, as in, say, my father's sister or my mother's sister, well, my aunt, such and such happened, and that's why we should or shouldn't have gun control, right? That's an anecdote. It's a personal story. Everybody seems to have some sort of personal connection. Now, the thing about an anecdote, it is great at sort of establishing the closeness of the event, of the topic that's being argued, right? So it shows that we, to some degree, have some sort of skin in the game, as it were, right? If I was to talk about traffic laws, I might talk about the last time like a car ran a red light and I almost got hit by it. Ooh, scary, right? But that is only one moment. It is hardly statistics. And because something happens once, that is not necessarily a guarantee that it happens all the time. And so that is both the strength and the weakness of the anecdote. The strength is the fact that it establishes some form of authority, right? I know this because it happened to me. But it also, and it gives us some sort of connection, right? Because if we're playing sort of 7 degrees of whatever it is that's happened, or whatever it is that we're arguing, by putting ourselves in proximity to it, it creates an emotional connection on the part of the reader, right? Because now the reader knows someone who's experienced this, even if they have nobody in their life to whom this has happened to. So that's the strength, but the downside is that by and large, an anecdote can simply be an exception. By the way, if you hear some squeaking, I got Hercules next to my chair with his toy. So any squeaking that's happening is largely him with his little dinosaur. Let's see. Oh, I've got your attention. So anecdote is like many things in persuasive writing. Many of the tools that we have in persuasive writing have their strengths, have their weaknesses, and that's why we can't rely on simply using one tool the whole time. So if we use something like anecdote, now I said the weakness of anecdote is that it's, that could just be talking about one person, right? Or you could say like, oh, a bunch of my friends, X, Y, and Z. Now that at most could be like, say, 10 people. So we're yet to really sort of cracking the notion that this is a widespread thing, or something that we really should be concerned about on a wider scale. So we anticipate that, and we move to something that can work with that weakness, right? So if I'm telling you an anecdote, the weakness of the anecdote is that it can seem, it's just one happenstance, it's one instance, right? What would we then want to use to offset the anecdote, or offset the weakness of the anecdote? Right? So downside of the anecdote, we don't exactly have a sense of how grand or how widespread this is. So what would we use? Well, we'd use something that anecdote would also be the remedy to. Statistics. Now, statistics, fabulous, because data. And data, while a lot of times seeming reliable, data can just be used for however we want to interpret it. A lot of people like to feel like numbers are solid things, that you can't futz with numbers. You can't change cold hard fact. You can change how you interpret it, and that's crucial. However, statistics gives us a sense of how grand the problem is, right? We can take that anecdote where I talk about almost getting struck by a car at a red light, and we can look at how many times has that happened? How many times has that happened and been fatal? Suddenly, we get a sense of the scale of the problem. Now, the downside of statistics, is again we can give a sense of scale of the problem, but statistics, because they're numbers, is rather impersonal. How do we, if we say something affects 1 million people, do any of us know what 1 million people looks like? How many people is 1 million people? I can tell you the population of the state of New York is something like 19.5 million. I don't even know what that looks like. So, suddenly, we have the scale of statistics, but it's so disconnected. It's impersonal. So, how do we counter that impersonal, qualities of statistics? Well, we do so with anecdote. So, this is just kind of how we can use multiple tools of rhetoric and writing to sort of improve our ways of persuasion, right? So Anzaldua, in using this historical fact, what she's done is she's created for us an example and a bit of history where suddenly this idea of a border makes you really question. It's like, oh, what does that border really mean? If suddenly, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and that whole chunk of land, was at one point Mexico, and then overnight became part of the United States, and the 100,000 Native Mexican people were suddenly in the United States. Overnight, they were what some might consider illegal aliens. Because surely, you'd have to consider that a border change of such a grand scale would leave a lot of people feeling quite confused. Because then what is your home? Is your home the four walls that surround you? Is it your bookshelves or your dogs? Is it your state? Like, is New York State our home? But if it was suddenly property of the Netherlands, right? What then? Are we suddenly like, well, guess we are God save the Netherlands and whatever ruling body, whether it's kings, queens, or parliaments or whatnot? What is, and within asking this idea of like, what is home, right? So for many of these Mexican citizens who are suddenly in the United States, are they home? The border shifted overnight. Suddenly they're in a different country. Is that home? These are the questions that tend to invigorate, I think, the humanities majors. And for me, I love it because I love these sort of questions that don't have concrete answers, and questions where I will have a different answer to, say, many of our classmates. Drives the people who really want like a sort of black and white, clear yes, no, clear right, wrong answer. Kind of drives those folks, drives them to annoyance. However, this is how Anzaldua challenges our perception of what a border is. If we are looking to redefine a term, a great way to do it is to challenge it, right? Our assignment for our definition essay is to define what a patriot is, or what patriotism is. Now, a great way to challenge or to define that is to challenge it. Getting ahead of myself, I know. So, how do we challenge what a patriot is? Surely there are many examples within history where we have people of all kinds claiming to be patriots. Now, that becomes really interesting, right? I mean, anybody who's paid attention or participated in the last presidential election, you had people of all sides and all parties and all political leanings describing themselves or their candidate as a patriot. So, surely it's not political leaning. Now, I'm not going to sit here and provide you an answer. Just questions. Questions that, hopefully, you'll be able to work out in your essay. Now, I use Anzaldua to show us another form of essay writing, another form of definition essay, right? She works on talking about what a borderland is, what a border is, right? So here she says, so this is on page 25. She says, one definition she gives is that borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants. Beautiful writing. Los atravesados live here. The squint-eyed, the perverse, the queer, the troublesome, the mongrel, the mulatto, the half-breed, the half-dead, in short, those who cross over, pass over, or go through the confines of the normal. Now, loaded text. And keep in mind, the scale of her definition is the scale of a book that is not necessarily a skinny boy. So keep that in mind. Like, you know, she kind of keeps the definition rather broad because this is something that she's going to argue over the course of a book. Our essay, our definition essay, is much shorter, 500 to 600 words, I believe. So, don't worry about, being so poetic is all that. What I want to recommend is that, look at Homeland, the essay, that's the title of the essay. Look at Homeland, look at the preface, syllable on the wrong, emphasis on the wrong syllable. But yeah, look at the preface, look at Homeland, and consider that as definition work. look at that as something to emulate, right? And so, and consider that Anzaldua is writing from what she considers an identity on the border, right? Something that is neither here nor there, neither one thing or another. For her, it is her identity as a Chicana American, right? Living in Texas on a border town. She is someone who is bilingual. And even, she discusses even the kind of Spanish she speaks is very rooted to where she's from. And there's also the aspect, there's the aspect of her as a woman. There's the aspect of her as queer, right? These identities that are oppressed or marginalized identities that also inform this work, right? They also have a presence in this work because we cannot divorce ourselves from our nonfiction writing. We cannot, I cannot write as not me. that would be frankly impossible. It would essentially just be a long lie. So, you are present in the work, and I encourage you to be. In our discussion, I do want us to talk about this as a hybrid work. So many of you might have noticed that this is written both in prose and in verse, or in like a poetry form, right? So it's part essay, part poetry. What do we think the point of that is, right? What does that show? If we're talking about borders, if we're talking about classifications, right? Because is that not what a border is a form of classifying? She kind of alludes to that when she says that, a border designates safe and unsafe, us and them, right? That's designation, that's classification. So if a border is about classifying, them, us, here, there, then is not making a work that is both essay and poetry at once challenging. That's, another system of classification. Is having a work that is both in English and in Spanish challenging these forms of classification. All questions to be kicked about, right? That's I think that's the joy of discussion, and that's the beauty of reading something with a class or reading something with other people, is getting multiple and various perspectives on it. If everybody just agrees, that's boring. Bunch of fucking cowards. Come on. But let's kick around this idea in the discussion. So look at this essay as further sort of material that we can possibly emulate. I know personally, I'm reading this book for my comps exam, but I'm also reading it to help inform my dissertation, because my dissertation is a hybrid work, right? And that's my dissertation is talking about things that are neither, is talking about classification similarly, and it's both poetry and prose as well. So I want us to think about the shape of our essays. Like, an essay doesn't just have to be that 5-paragraph essay, right? The one we've all probably written in high school. But an essay can be whatever we want it to be. The whole idea is that it's nonfiction, and so it is in some way, we have this promise with an essay it's a promise between us and the readers that it's basically saying, I promise that I am telling you my truth, and we earn the trust of our readers by providing things like fact, by providing things like anecdote that show why this is an important topic to us. And we'll talk about the appeals later. So if you know them, great. If you don't, no sweat. That's cool too. But we'll talk about the appeals in terms of like emotional appeal, logical appeal, and the appeal of authority, and we'll that'll, if you know it, you know it. If you don't, that's cool. But I do want us to get to understanding and asking questions about our own writing. Like, how do we engage with our reader in a meaningful way? How do we show, the importance of a topic to a reader? How do we get our reader involved? Right? Because to some degree, by the end of our essay, we want our reader to do something, or to think something, or to say something, or to take action of some sort. That's where persuasion comes in. And that's how writing can kind of change us, change each other, change our readers. Is it's a way of sharing. It's a way of educating your reader, right? And that's, I think, education is the natural state of humans, right? Think about the last time you learned something. Could be a fun fact, right? The last time you learned something, first thing you probably wanted to do was share it with somebody. Could have been anything. Could have been any little fact. I mean, it could be just the section that I read from Homeland right now about 1846 U.S.-Mexican War. Overnight, 4 or 5 states worth of land went from being Mexico to the United States. Boom, 100,000 people displaced. The fuck, right? You might want to share that. You might, especially if it makes you look smart, that helps. But we share things because at heart we're teachers. At heart, people, because I think, and this is opinion, because we are very social creatures, we share things. Because through evolution, that's how we survived, right? Oh, there's food over there, and it's enough for us. Or don't eat that, it's poisonous. When we have knowledge, we share it because that's how we survive. So yeah. Hope you all enjoyed the essay. Hope you enjoyed the lecture video, but yeah, I know that's asking a bit much. However, keep an eye on the discussion board, and I'll post the assignment as well. All right. Have a good weekend.